Let's bow our heads for prayer as we begin. Father, be with me as I speak up here. Let it not be my words or my message or my challenges or anything about me. Let it all be about you and what you have done for me as well as everybody else here in this room. Let it all be about you and everything pointing upward to you. We love you and just thank you in advance for answering our prayer. We love you. Amen. This morning, I want to share with you a passage that I'd never seen in the Bible before. And I imagine if I had never seen this passage in the Bible before, you may not have actually seen this passage in the Bible. And it may be surprising, but I've read the Bible through at least twice from cover to cover. And for some strange reason, I've never seen this passage. And so it prompted me to wonder, is somebody sticking things in my Bible? I don't know, maybe you guys have had that thought. Are you sure that was really in that original language? Because that just doesn't make sense. But I cross-checked it with probably half a dozen or more different translations, and it says about the same thing in every single translation. But the passage, the specific verse, just bothered me to no end. And as I wrestled with it, it started to change my story. It started to change how I saw God. And it also helped me to understand more about his character and really kind of more about God's perspective. But I don't know if you guys have ever had an experience like that, like I have, where you're going along, you're going through your life, you're actually writing your life story with each moment, with each event, with each decision. You're progressing along through your life story, and then all of a sudden something happens and it changes. It could be a bad event, some tragic event that comes and it just deviates your life story, or it could be a piece of new information or something that you've never seen before. A little bit about my story is, as I look into the past, I began my life in a small city in Red Deer, Alberta, Canada. Yeah, that's right, I am Canadian for the handful of you that are so as far as us from up north. But I'll say the one person who's the hardest isn't here today, so I'm good. But so my life started there, and for the first 9 years of my life, we lived in Alberta. And it's my mom, my dad, my older sister, and me. But somewhere around 9 or 10, not sure exactly which, my parents' marriage got a little rocky and they ended up divorcing. And so somewhere in the ages of 9 or 10, it's kind of foggy in my memory, they got divorced, and my mom, my sister, and I moved to Ontario, Canada. So across the country over where the Great Lakes are. And for the next 9 years or so of my life, I lived there. And during that time, a little bit closer to the end of that time, my mom met another guy, and they ended up getting married, but he lived in Ohio, an American. And so she moved down to Ohio, and I had a choice, I had a decision. Do I move down to Ohio with them, or do I stay at the academy that I had started at? And so I made the decision to stay at the academy. So 10th grade on, 10th, 11th, and 12th, I lived in the dorm in academy. And then following graduation, I decided, okay, well, maybe I'll go to the States. Maybe I'll move down to the US. So I went down to Nebraska, the middle of nowhere, cornfields all across everything. And I went to college at Union. Some of you are laughing because that's really what the impression of Nebraska is like. There's even a city there? What? I thought it was just rows and rows of corn. Anyways. So I went there, went to Union, graduated. One of those weird people who went in with one major, stayed with that major, graduated in 4 years. I don't know if we exist anymore, or if that's even something that happens, but I may be one of those last people who did that. And then following graduation, I moved out here to Idaho to help my cousin who wanted a little bit of design help. I majored in graphic design, so I came out here to help him with some projects he was working on. And then maybe within a year or so after moving out here, a job opened up at Pacific Press, and I applied. And I tell people I probably was the only person who applied because they picked me. But anyways, and then I started working at Pacific Press, and I've been there ever since. But when you look at a story, when you look at a life story from such a broad view, like the 30 or 40,000 foot view, everything looks really smooth. Everything kind of makes sense. But as soon as you start coming down a little closer, things start to get a little bit more rocky, a little bit less smooth. And there's some things that just don't make sense. There are some things that happen that you're like, why did that happen? I don't understand it. Maybe when you look at your life, you look back in your past and you ask yourself, I don't understand why that event happened. Why did that occur? Why was that allowed into my life? Or why was I so stupid that I actually brought that into my life? That could be some of you. And there's just some things about our stories that make sense, but there's some things about our stories that don't make sense. And when we look out and when we look at other people's lives and when we look at the world around us, there's things that make sense, like when we look at our life, but there's also things that don't make sense. And it's been this way for a really long time. It was even this way back when Jesus was walking around on the earth in the first century. There was an elite group of religious leaders who had observed the past. They looked back at Israel's history. They looked back at the writings of Moses. They looked back and they saw the progression. But there was just something about what had happened that didn't make sense. What they were told versus what they were being told at that point, it just didn't add up. And so they were wondering, this elite group of leaders, oftentimes the ones that had the biggest headbutts with Jesus as he was walking around, was a group known as the Pharisees. And this group of people, they looked back at history, they looked at the ups and downs and the rocky road, and they said, well, we saw that Moses came, he gave us the law, God promised that we obey him, we stay with him, we obey his law, he'll be with us, we'll prosper, but if we don't, then we won't prosper. And they saw this whole roller coaster of up with God, blessing, down with God, we're enslaved. Up with God, blessing, and it's like a generational roller coaster. Read the book of Judges, that's pretty much the entire book of Judges is this roller coaster. And then they saw the kings and they saw how with the kings that were with God, everything was good, but the majority of the kings weren't, and things weren't all that good. And then it got so bad that God even kicked them out of the promised land, and they were exiled for a generation or two. But God kept his promise, and they came back to him, and they saw this roller coaster, and they said, it's probably because we disobeyed God's rules so that we had all of this bad stuff happen to us. And perhaps it would make sense to put up some pre-rules. And so they created this network of pre-rules that would hopefully keep them from even coming close to disobeying the real rules. And so by the time Jesus came around, they had created this elaborate system of rules to keep them from actually breaking the rules, but they put so much focus on the pre-rule so that if you broke a pre-rule, then they acted like you were breaking a rule. And this was the Pharisees, and we could call them the legalists because they just loved the rules. But there was another group of elite religious leaders. And in my mind's eye, if we could call the Pharisees the legalists, we could call this elite group the purists. Because they saw the history, they saw kind of where the Pharisees had gotten stuff from, and they saw the prophets and all of this stuff, but they said, we're not going to take any of that, we're not entirely sure what to make of that outside of history, but we do know way back at the beginning that God spoke to Moses, and so we're going to only focus on the books of Moses for what we believe. And this group of people, this group of elite religious leaders were called the Sadducees. And the one defining characteristic of the Sadducees that the four Gospels bring out is that they did not believe in the resurrection. They saw the timeline, and they specifically were only looking at the books of Moses, and they said, there's nothing really in the books of Moses that really talk about the resurrection. Sure, it was kind of alluded to in some of this other stuff maybe, but Moses didn't say it, and so we don't believe it. And not only that, in the passage that we're going to look at today, they had devised this illustration, and depending upon the translation you look at, or which gospel you're reading, it could be interpreted that this actually happened, and they're saying, hey, this thing actually happened, and we're not sure exactly what to do with it. Or it could be this hypothetical situation. Because there's one specific point where the Sadducees come to Jesus. And in my mind, Jesus and the Pharisees are butting heads. The Sadducees are kind of standing back and saying, go, Jesus, you just put those Pharisees in their place. Just keep on, just put them in their place. But as Jesus kept on talking and kept on teaching, they got a little uneasy because he's putting this idea of the resurrection, but the resurrection's not in Moses' books. So they came up with this illustration or this event, and they said, we need to ask Jesus' question because we could either trap him, we could maybe catch him off guard. Apparently the Pharisees aren't doing a good job of catching him off guard. Maybe this is a dilemma that Jesus can't solve. And so they come to Jesus, and this is recorded, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you want, you can follow along in Matthew. That's where we're going to start. Matthew chapter 22. And they come to Jesus and they present their question. But before they present their question, they kind of have this little pre-question to kind of bait Jesus into agreeing with them. I don't know if you've ever experienced somebody, they come to you with their request but they want to get you to say a couple yeses before they really sock you with the hard question or sock you with that sale. So they come to Jesus and they say, so Jesus, marriage is a thing from God, right? Yeah, marriage is from God. Back in the Garden of Eden, back in the very, very, very beginning, marriage, God, perfect world, God created man and woman, married them, everything's good. Marriage is good. Yeah, marriage is from God. Marriage is good. All right, so in the writings of Moses, we read that God instructed him to tell the people that if a man and woman get married and then they die childless, the woman is supposed to then get married to the spouse or the brother of that man, of the deceased man. And is that really just so we're on the same page? You understand God spoke that through Moses for the people that the widow is supposed to marry the brother. Yeah. If God spoke that through Moses. So we had this thing that happened to us and it just doesn't make any sense. So I hope you can help us understand this a little bit better. So suppose you have 7 brothers. 7 brothers. And the oldest brother here, he meets this attractive young lady, and they decide to get married. But they don't, or they're unable to have kids, and husband dies. So then they go to the next. The brother-in-law, he steps up, he's like, I'll fulfill the duties of Moses. You're safe with me, I'll marry you. We'll have a child for that brother. But unfortunately, he dies too. And it continues down the line. This brother steps up to the plate, but not so much. This brother steps up to the plate, and no luck. These three remaining brothers are wondering, what's going on here? This isn't looking so well for any of us, but we have to obey the laws of Moses. You're safe here, but I'm not sure exactly. I don't know if I want that. And they die, and this one dies. And finally, maybe the last one, but and then the woman, kind of feeling exhausted, not entirely sure what to do, she also dies. But the question that they have is really a question kind of on marriage, but it's really undertones their thoughts on the resurrection. Because the resurrection doesn't make sense if you put it with the marriage that God created at the beginning, one man, one woman, and this law that God gave Moses of that the brother should marry the deceased, like the widow. And because if you put that together, then you have the question, well, if the resurrection's there, like, let's suppose the resurrection's true, let's suppose everybody gets raised and goes to heaven, well, who's this woman going to be married to? She was married to all of them. And it's not like this one or that one was able to have kids to kind of uneven the odds. They were all essentially equal. They were all childless. And so they come to Jesus with this question. If you're following along in Matthew, let's read exactly what happens in Matthew. Because it's fascinating what goes on. So, leading it. On that day, some Sadducees, and this is where they preface it, Sadducees who say that people will never come back to life, they came to Jesus and they asked him, "Teacher, Moses said if a man dies childless, his brother should marry his widow and have children for his brother." Jesus said, "Yeah. There were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and since he had no children, he left his widow to his brother. The second brother also died, as well as the third and the rest of the 7 brothers. And at last the woman died." And here's the question. Now when the dead come back to life, I'm thinking in my mind you're saying, if the dead, but we'll say when the dead come back to life, all 7 brothers had been married to her, and really whose wife will she be? And this is where Jesus' response kind of makes me curious, a little confused, and not really sure exactly what to think. Because Jesus then answered, "You're mistaken, because you don't know the scriptures. You don't even know the books of Moses that you're talking about, but you're really mistaken because you don't know God's power. When people come back to life, they don't marry. Rather, they are like the angels in heaven. Haven't you read what God told you about the dead coming back to life? He said, 'I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.' He is not the God of the dead, but of the living." He amazed the crowds who heard his teaching. Now, Jesus' response to them, on one level, makes sense. But on a completely other level, I'm left really wondering how that response actually satisfied what the question was. On the first part of the response, it makes sense. When people come back to life, they don't marry. Jesus is answering the specific angle of the question, when the dead come back to life. Whose wife is, who's going to be your husband? And Jesus clearly answers that it's not going to be any, because we're going to be more like the angels in heaven who don't marry. But we're going to have this intimate, one-on-one relationship with God. But the second part of the response, it baffles me, but it baffles and confuses me, but it also kind of challenges me to wonder, is there something that we're missing in how the English language has translated these passages? Because Jesus then continues and hits on the issue of the resurrection. Haven't you read what God told you about the dead coming back to life? This is the resurrection angle now. He said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. If you think about this response, it doesn't really, at least as I read it, it doesn't answer the question of whether or not the dead come back to life. Jesus is saying, hey, God is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He says this to Moses, who lived several hundred years after these people. And if you think about it, God who exists, who's immortal, who can't die, of course he could be the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. They lived a long time ago. God was there a long time ago. But now there's Moses, really, and now there's these Sadducees. God's still the same God, but those people have already died. It doesn't, when you look at what Jesus is answering, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't really answer the question of whether or not the dead come back to life. And so I wonder in my mind that what Jesus is actually saying here. Good news for us, or maybe bad news. 3 of the 4 gospel writers include this timeline dilemma. And they include Jesus' response. So if we were to flip over and look at Mark, which we're not going to do this morning, but I encourage you to do so. Mark's version very closely parallels Matthew's version. But Luke starts this event very similar. Starts with this timeline dilemma: whose husband, who's going to be the one married? But when he gets to Jesus' response, we have a different slant to Jesus' words. And I want to warn you guys that as we read Luke's response, Luke's account of Jesus' words, it might make you a little uncomfortable. I'm actually probably pretty sure it's going to make you uncomfortable because Luke's version of this passage takes a shot at really one of the biggest issues in Christianity today. And it doesn't, and this issue in Christianity, people have created all sorts of different camps around, and different groups saying it's one way, it's the other way, it's the other way. And Luke's account of Jesus' words takes a shot at all of them. And it says, all may have an element of truth, but all fall short of what actually is the truth. And I've never heard a pastor, a speaker, or anybody really tackle or touch on Luke's response to this, on Luke's account of this. And so as you flip over to Luke, it's Luke chapter 20, I want to read with you this response. The issue that we're dealing with is not marriage, but resurrection. And not specifically on the resurrection, but on the state one is in before they're resurrected. Is the resurrection, as a lot of Christians pose, something that happens like when you die, you go straight to heaven, and then God comes back and he brings you, and at that point he gives you a new body? Or is it God looks at you, you pass away, you sleep in the ground, no consciousness, and then you're raised? And Luke, quoting Jesus' words, takes a stab at both of these beliefs. And so let's read this together. Because as I read this, I was baffled at what I discovered. So Jesus said, Luke 20, starting in verse 34, this is Jesus responding now to this timeline dilemma. Jesus said to them, in this world people get married. But people who are considered worthy to come back to life and live in the next world will neither marry nor die anymore. Okay, Jesus first tells us marriage is kind of a litmus test. A test to determine what world we're living in, what age we're living in. Some translations use age versus this world versus the next world, this age versus the next age. And marriage is a defining characteristic of this age, but not of the future age. And so this takes a stab. If you've come here this morning, this might irritate you because there's a gap between these ages. And there's no promise that you're conscious during that gap. But as we continue this response, Jesus has some words for the other group. So he continues, they are the same as angels, they are God's children who have come back to life. Life has a pause. We're kind of still on that first group. But here's where things get really kind of iffy. Because Jesus then switches over to talk about Moses. Even Moses, in the passage about the bush, that the dead come back to life. He says that the Lord is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here we get to it. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. In God's sight, all people are living. This last sentence, this last phrase, I'd never seen in the Bible before. This last phrase bothers, like I read it as I was studying through the Gospels and kind of cross-checking the different Gospel accounts. And why would Luke do this? Matthew and Mark, it's kind of clean, it's a little confusing, but why would Luke do this? Because he takes this stab and he says, in God's sight, all people are living. Not all people are sleeping. Not all the people in the past are sleeping. All people are living. And this passage bothers me. And it might bother some of you here today too. Because why would Luke do this? And if Luke did this, why? And if this is really what Jesus said, then we really should be kind of irritated at Jesus. Why would Jesus say this? And I encourage you to flip in your Bible, see if this specific sentence is in your Bible. You can do it now, you can do it later. Because as I was studying this passage, it bothered me. And what kind of actually humored me is that I've never heard this passage, or really any of this response of Jesus used in any of the arguments surrounding the state of the dead. The people who say death is asleep obviously probably don't want to focus on this, but they could focus on the earlier part of this passage where God's saying, hey, the people who are going to come back to life, they could focus on that because that aligns with what people might refer to as soul sleep, or that people sleep, because people come back to life. Before that, they don't have life. But they don't really want to touch this passage because of this sentence here. But the flip side is also true, because the people who say that death isn't the end, that death is merely a transition and you go straight to heaven, they love this phrase, but they don't really like the other phrase. And so I've never heard this passage even really discussed. Luke kind of gets pushed off to the sidelines. It's almost as though when the initial group of people who had this argument about really what happens when you die, they were combing through the scriptures and they said, okay, that works for that one, that works for that one, and we'll argue about this one, we'll argue about that one. We'll argue about punctuation and Jesus' promise to a criminal on a cross. We'll argue about what Jesus really meant when he was talking about this rich guy who died and this poor beggar named Lazarus. Not the same Lazarus that Jesus raised, but a different one. And really what Jesus was trying to teach in that. Or we'll argue about really what John was experiencing and seeing when he was talking about souls in the altar. Like souls at the altar, and asking the question of why wait? But when they came to this passage, they're like, promise I won't touch that if you don't touch that one. All right, let's keep moving on. Everybody agree we're not touching this passage? Everybody agree? All right, we're not going to touch this passage because it kind of irritates all of us. And so that's kind of just my sanctified, maybe not so sanctified imagination of why this passage was probably dropped out of the discussion. Because it kind of seems to take a shot at every angle that you can look at what happens when you die, and really, after death, between death and resurrection, what happens. But hidden in this phrase, if we look at it just a little bit closer, is the answer. In this phrase is the answer that unravels a lot of what the rest of the Bible talks about regarding death. In God's sight, all people are living. You see it yet? In God's sight. With that phrase, we have perspective. In God's sight. There's three different terms that theologians and religious people like to throw around describing God. We have omnipotent, which means all-powerful. We have omnipresent, which means present everywhere at the same time. And we have omniscient, which means all-knowing. God knows everything. But there's another characteristic that describes God. And as I was trying to figure out how to unpack and how to describe this other characteristic of God, I really, really wanted to come up with the word, probably create a word because the word doesn't exist. It starts with omni, because it would be really nice to have the 4 omnis. But it really, every word I kind of put with omni sounded kind of stupid. So I'll avoid sharing with you all of the list of kind of failed attempts. But this other characteristic of God is that he's outside of time. God is up here and he's looking at the timeline of history. God is up here and he sees people kind of over here, maybe around where we're at in history. And he sees people that lived maybe a couple hundred years ago. He sees people who lived a little bit before. This little lady's kind of up here by herself, so let's add another little lady. So it's not skewed too far in one direction. And he's looking down at all of this timeline, all of this history. And as he's looking at the timeline, all people are living. But what does that mean? What can we use to really unpack and maybe imagine what it might be like from God's perspective? And I want to tell you, today, in our modern culture, it's probably the easiest that it's ever been to understand this passage and this idea from God's perspective. Easier than it has been for the last 500,000, 2,000 years. Because if we look around in our culture today, there's timelines everywhere. We call them novels, we call them books, we call them movies, we call them YouTube videos. Every one of these things has a timeline. Some movies, they kind of jump around in the timeline. They maybe start kind of close to the end of the movie, and then they are consistently flashing back to earlier parts of the timeline. There's some movies that are kind of clear, and you start at the beginning, you just kind of move through it, stuff happens, and there's the end. And it's easier for us if we take our favorite movie, or one of our favorite movies, or a movie that we've seen recently, we analyze and we say, okay, at some point in this movie, something happens to one of the main characters and, oh, they die. But for the rest of that movie, that character is no longer around. But if we wanted to, we could either start the movie again, or we could rewind. We could watch the first part of the movie and, hey, that character's alive. It kind of even translates a little bit into between movies and real life by when we look at, if you have any old movies. Old movies where the actors themselves have already passed away, have already died. But you can stick that movie in, you can load it up on any one of your streaming services. And you can watch that movie, you can watch that actor, and it's as though they're still alive. It's like they're over here, but in reality, they're not. And in this phrase is a perspective shift. It's a perspective shift because it says in God's sight all people are living. God is looking down at this timeline. And if we're over here in the timeline and we're saying, I wonder why God did this to somebody back there. Like, it's kind of sad that they had died back there. To God, all he has to do is step back and look over. He says, oh, they're living. It's not like they're living at this point. He just look at the timeline and say, oh yeah, they're living over there. And this is where this passage, this phrase, I started to unpack and see how there's a deeper meaning to this. And how if we take this seemingly avoided phrase from that everybody is kind of left out of the discussion, it helps us understand almost every one of the other difficult passages regarding death. Because death is one of those things that we don't like in life. It kind of doesn't make sense all the time. It's like, did that person die knowing God? Did that person die when their time was right? There's more questions surrounding death than really life. But if we look at this phrase, in God's sight all people are living, we can trust that God knows what he's doing in this timeline of history. And we might not understand it. We are in the timeline of history. But understand that God's not. God can jump back out. He can move to a different spot, and he can go in. It actually, as I've thought more about this idea, it almost helps me understand some of the omni words that are used by God. That he's all-knowing. He can look really closely at one specific spot in the timeline and see exactly what's going on. He knows everything about that one spot. And he's everywhere. If he's outside of time, he can jump in at any single point. And he has jumped in, and he's worked at every single point. But he can go back and he can look and he can say, did I do that? Did I want to do that a little differently? Let's do it a little differently. We wouldn't know the difference. We're in the timeline. But in this passage, and in this idea that in God's sight all people are living, it forces me to realize that I'm in the timeline. Each one of us here are in the timeline of history. And we each have a part to play. Each of us is writing a story, writing our life story on the part in history, that we're living. And individually, we might have a little tiny sliver. Maybe a sentence in the broad scheme, maybe just a word. But we're a part of history's timeline. But history's timeline, in and of itself, is a story. It's a story of Jesus and what he did for us on the cross. If we look at the timeline of history, we have to filter everything through what Jesus did for us. And it's not about any one of our little stories and what we write into our experiences and what we decide in the decisions and the things that we write into our life. What we need to remember is that we're actually writing on history's timeline. Every little decision, every choice that we make, it might be a little sentence, a little word, but it's written on history's timeline. And history is not just history. history is really his story. It's not about us. It's about him. It's about Jesus. It's about what God did for us as we go through our lives. As we make our decisions, as we live online and offline and doing all sorts of stuff in our modern world, what are we writing onto our life story, which is ultimately also being written on his story? And the amazing thing about this timeline dilemma, this what happens when we die, is that when death comes, whether it's our death, whether it's the death of a loved one, know that they're safe in history's timeline. And that when Jesus returns at the very end of history, at the very end of his story, he's going to be able to look back on the timeline and call out to everyone who is his, and everyone will raise up and be with him. And that, my friends, is an amazing promise that Jesus gave us. And it's something that because God is all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere, and because he is outside of time, we can have full confidence that it will happen.